in the webinar today that will be useful for all of you out there. So I thought I'd start at the very beginning and kind of ask the question, what is statutory guidance? When there is an Act of Parliament, when we have legislation, each piece of legislation comes with statutory guidance. So statutory guidance set out the legal duties that you must follow to safeguard, and in the case of keeping children safe in education, promote the welfare and children of young people under the age of 18 in schools and colleges. Statutory guidance is useful because if there is a change, a small change, or something unusual comes along, a worldwide pandemic, we can update and change the guidance of how the laws should be interpreted and put into action without going back into the House of Commons, without creating new legislation. We can change how that legislation should be adapted and implemented. I like to think of it rather like the idiot's guide that you buy when you've got the computer. You buy the Word for Dummies. That explains in layperson speech how to meet the requirements in the law. People say to me, why do we need to follow statutory guidance? What happens if we ignore it? Well, you ignore it at your peril, because statutory guidance, even though it's not the law, actually has the same weight as the law, and you must obey it. In the legislation, there are two types of phrases. First of all, there's words where it says that include the word must. And this is when the person in question is legally required to do it. So when the guidance says that schools must, you have to do it. You have no choice. However, sometimes it says schools should do the following. What that means is that you really should do it unless you've got a particularly good reason not to do so. So statutory guidance, it's the information that interprets the law, in this case the Education Act. It gives reference to other bits of associated legislation, a bit like the Children Act, and it gives you the practice guidance. It tells you how to implement the law in an education setting. Why does safeguarding guidance, like keeping children safe in education, need to be regularly updated? Why don't we just have one set of guidance brought in when we get the legislation and keep that forever? Well, there are other changes in the law and other changes in guidance which affect education. So, for instance, there might be changes about police checks, about data and barring. There might be other bits of legislation around criminal justice or social services, which will have an effect on safeguarding and education. So the education guidance needs to match the other guidance that's out there. It needs to be updated for that. And also, if there is other legislation that's brought in, it needs to incorporate that in the guidance. It also needs to account for changes in terminology, changes in the language that we use. So, for instance, many years ago, well, back in the 1970s, we talked, for instance, about battered wives. This fell out of use, and then they started talking about realizing that all the victims weren't necessarily the wives. They might be all other women, so they talked about battered women. That wasn't a very good description, and the terminology changed to domestic violence. And that became the standard phrase for many years. And people started to realize we're not just talking about violence. There are other forms of intimidation, sexual violence, economic and financial abuse, other kinds of abuse like that. So they changed the phrase, and it's the word that we talk about now as domestic abuse. So those changes make it more accurately reflect what the situation actually is. And we'll talk more about the changes in language as we go along, as we look at this particular year's update. There are also changes in the safeguarding challenge. Since the introduction of the Education Act, we have seen some massive changes in the safeguarding challenge. And those changes that I'm sure you're all aware, particularly around digital technology, mobile phones, a real challenging for all of us involved in keeping children safe. I was looking at the news a couple of months ago about a young woman in London who commits suicide as a result of artificial intelligence generated photographs of her involved in sexual acts that she'd had done nothing to do with, and these were being spread around the school, and the young girl commits suicide. And now these kind of things, artificially generated pornography that look like real people, look like real children, are a new challenge for us, something that was unthinkable even a year or two ago, and now affecting the lives of children in schools throughout the UK. We also need to learn from serious case reviews. When a child dies or is seriously injured, there is a process called a serious case review. A senior social worker will look at the case, how this came to pass, how the child died, and if there could have been anything we could have done to save that child's life. Could the policy, if the policy was different, perhaps it wasn't put in practice, what learning can we get out of this tragedy? And one of the things why we need to update guidance is to make sure that those deaths of those children are not for nothing, that we learn from those deaths. And finally, it's really useful to look at understanding developments in good practice. There are some schools out there that have great ideas, great practice around safeguarding, and government often looks at that good practice and says, let's include that in the safeguarding guidance and spread it to other schools. Let's have a look at keeping children safe in education September 2024. Well, perhaps the biggest news is that there are no major changes. There are no significant policy changes, but there are some important changes in the language used in the guidance. And I think we'll look at this a little bit later, but those changes in language actually matter a lot in terms of our attitude and the breadth of the safeguarding challenge we're facing. It talks about child protection outside the home. For many of us, we've looked at thought of child protection as protecting children from abuse within their family. And one of the growing understanding of safeguarding is that there are sometimes significant challenges to keeping children safe, and those threats occur outside the home. They occur through IT, the digital world, the World Wide Web, mobile phones, through radicalization and through criminal exploitation. The also changes have occurred is that there have been changes in the guidance that go with the Children Act and the guidance document that goes with that, which is working together to safeguard children. And the keeping children safe in education has been updated so that those two bits of guidance are aligned in terms of language and protocol. So they're consistent with one another. And there are some important changes about children missing from education. And again, more changes in language about LGBT children and young people. And most importantly, the importance of information sharing and recording decisions taken. So why do we need these changes? To ensure that keeping children safe in education is in line and consistent with working together to safeguard children 2023, which is the guidance that social workers and people outside education use to keep children safe. That document was updated in December 2023. This is catch up for keeping children safe in education, and they've done it to include references to early help to try and divert children from the sharp end of safeguarding the child at risk category. Providing help and support to meet the needs of children as soon as these problems emerge, rather than leaving it before it becomes acute or critical. As I mentioned, there are some important changes in language contained in the document. There's a great function that I discovered in Adobe Acrobat, and I was able to look at both documents and go through each line, line by line. What was really interesting is perhaps the most significant change is the addition of the word exploitation. Now occurs on an extra 10 occasions. And why this change is important, it's because where the phrase abuse and neglect we use, it's now being replaced by abuse, neglect and exploitation. And I think this goes in line with that idea of seeing that the abuse of children, about keeping children safe, is no longer confined to school and home, that there can be abuse, neglect and exploitation outside the home, particularly around criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation. The word exploitation now occurs in the document 63 times. And it suggests a widening of the areas of safeguarding children. So why does language matter? Language is important because it frames our attitude and influences our response to victims. We saw this quite clearly in the abuse of young people in care, where the police were referring to them as prostitutes rather than victims of grooming and sexual abuse. Often it's unconscious. When we use language like that, for instance, we rarely intend to blame these children and young people, but by using that language, that bias against them becomes unconscious. So the language we use is shaped and normalized within the cultures we work. As I mentioned earlier, when I gave the example about domestic violence, domestic abuse, battered wives, again, it makes the abuse more understandable and more accurate. We also need to understand that language is always changing, and terms that were common in the recent past may no longer be acceptable. So one of the changes, the definition of safeguarding, which is quite a kind of fundamental statement within the guidance, it's been changed to protecting children from maltreatment, whether that is within the home or outside the home, including online. And as we've seen, that can be things like criminal exploitation, county lines, sexual exploitation, things like online grooming, sextortion, blackmailing children when they've shared illegal or nude images or sexual images of themselves. And this is an approach to understanding and responding to young people's experience of significant harm, may well be beyond their families and have nothing to do with the care that they receive in the home. One of the challenges when guidance like this says that we need to change all these terms can be a real challenge. Domestic abuse is something that not only affects women, it also affects children. One of the developing themes in safeguarding is the harm done to children by living in an environment where domestic abuse occurs. The Child and Adoption Act in 2002 redefined the definition of significant harm to include children who live in an environment where domestic abuse occurs of significant harm. And this is reiterated in the guidance. And practitioners are reminded that the harm may be caused where they see, hear, or experience its effects, not necessarily getting in the middle and ending up on the wrong side of a punch or a slap, but actually hearing the screams going on downstairs, or being in the room where it takes place, or seeing the after effects on one of their parents, the bruises, the marks, the fear on them. And this can affect children in many ways and is considered to be under the category emotional abuse. And that the guidance underlines the fact that domestic abuse may extend beyond the signs of physical harm. So while children might not be physically bruised, they might be emotionally bruised, that might affect their schoolwork, that might affect the way that they're able to concentrate, their overall well-being, their ability to interact with other children, but also how they model themselves in terms of their relationship with their peers, whether they use violence, aggression and threats, or are unable to make strong relationships with others because of lack of trust. The next category where the guidance has come up with changes is with LGBT. Lesbian, gay, bi, or trans, that phrase has been replaced by children who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or gender questioning. Now, I know a lot of schools, a lot of teachers have been desperate for some clear guidance around this very challenging area. Sadly, this section remains under view pending the outcome of the gender questioning children's consultation. When that final consultation is finished, there will be a guidance document published as a result. So that's the only change that I can offer you at the moment from this update of keeping children safe in education. They've changed the term from lesbian, gay, bi, or trans to lesbian, gay, bisexual, or gender questioning. We should be expecting new guidance shortly. The other major change is around children missing in education. The change there is around language, the power of language, the meanings of language, the implication of language. The phrase deliberately missing education has been changed to unexplained and persistent absences. And there may be many reasons why children are missing education, and the word deliberate is very loaded and might explain a few cases, but not all of them, particularly around mental health and the post-COVID world that we've seen and the effects on children and their ability to sustain attendance in school. So instead, those words have been changed to unexplained and persistent absences. And again, I think this is a move to let's get terms that more accurately describe what the situation is without affecting the way that we view those children and their parents. So one of the great things about CPOMS is that it links with your MIS. And enables us to look at reasons why children might be missing education. What are the welfare, what are the safeguarding issues that might cause us that? So I'm going to hand this over to Sam, and Sam's going to show us how we can have data in CPOM Student Safe can mesh with your MIS and show us about attendance data and marry those two together.
So again, if there's any questions, feel free to get in touch, but I'm going to let John carry on because time's. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I wanted to move on to the next major change, and I think probably the most important one when it relates to CPOMs is the new recording requirements of keeping children safe in education. And I'm going to read this out. This is a new phrase: all concerns discussions and decisions made, including the rationale for those decisions. These recordings should include instances where referrals were or were not made to another agency, such as local authority, children's care, or the Prevent programme, etc. That for me is an important thing. Not only do we need to record our safeguarding concerns, we also need to record the discussions we've had with others about it. This might be the teacher talking to the DSL about their concerns, the decisions made as a result of those decisions, and the rationale for making those decisions. So we decided that it was important that we made a safeguarding referral to the local authority because we thought this reached the threshold for significant harm. But we should also be recording when referrals were not made. So, for instance, teacher Mr. Jones made a referral about David, and we were concerned about levels of neglect. We decided we would continue to monitor the situation and not make a referral to social services because the threshold of significant harm had not been reached, and we would use other methods such as discussing with the family support to ensure that that child's welfare was supported. So we make include the rationale for making those decisions, whether we made a referral or decided not to. One of the things I've come across in many schools is that often schools will record the decision to make a referral to social services, but very often when they've decided not to, when they've decided to continue to monitor the young person or the child, they've not included the rationale. They said why we've decided not to. When I speak to teachers, a lot of them worry that might be but really, I think it only requires kind of a sentence or two. And what it does demonstrate that you've considered why, that you've considered why you've decided to make a referral or not. An important step is where those referrals were made. As a school governor, that's really important. I want to see where the referrals were made and the outcome of those referrals. How many referrals were made to Prevent? How many were made to children's services? How many were made to the police? And what was the outcome? Did they go for Section 47 inquiries? Was an arrest made? What happened to that Prevent referral? Did that move forward, or was another outcome? So those are really important because they enable people like school governors to look at how effective the school safeguarding policies were, whether they were working. I like to think of myself as a critical friend as a safeguarding governor. I'm there to say, have you thought about this? What about that? That's the role that governors should be, because we're on your side. We're not there to trip them up. That's about it for all the changes in this year's Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance. We have had a general election this year, and it is useful to know that there are some important changes. There have been some significant changes in the government, and while safeguarding generally isn't one of those supercharged political arenas, there will be some significant changes. It's quite useful if we start thinking about how we can future-proof our safeguarding recording. And the first one is the Crime and Policing Bill. And one of the things that's going to be doing is that's trying to protect children who have been coerced into criminality, groomed into the world of perhaps county lines, of selling drugs or other criminal exploitation. Now, I've a close friend of mine who works in Neath, and he's involved in youth offending there. And one of the things involved in protecting children in the youth offending team. And one of the things he was telling me is that they've been working with the police to use modern slavery legislation to target the gang bosses who are exploiting children, recruiting them to run drugs, that kind of thing. Now, the modern slavery legislation was not designed for what they are using it for. And sooner or later, something is going to come unstuck. One of the things we've seen in the crime and policing bill that was in the King's speech is that the government plan to introduce new legislation to strengthen the law to tackle those who exploit children for criminal purposes. I think they're going to introduce a specific charge about exploiting and recruiting children into criminal exploitation. I think we'll also see stuff about radicalization. We've seen this as a result of the riots, and I'm pretty sure we'll see new legislation around new guidance about how we tackle radicalization amongst children and young people. Because I think that was one of the tragedies about how often young people were recruited into the rioting we saw recently. One of the big challenges for all schools, no matter whether they're involved in those places where unrest took place, but throughout the country and for a number of areas around criminal exploitation, around sexual exploitation of children, grooming, and fake news around the use of mobile phones. I'm pretty sure that there will be new guidance around this. And that's going to be one of the things that the Labour Party said they would be promoting critical thinking around the ideas of fake news and that kind of stuff in the curriculum. The biggest piece of legislation that will affect safeguarding in schools will be the Children's Wellbeing Bill. This will put a focus on education and require all schools to cooperate with local authorities on school admissions, SEND inclusions, planning by local authorities to give them greater powers. It'll also create a duty on local authorities to maintain not in school registers. So again, that could be another area that you need to start thinking about, and strengthening multi-agency child protection and safeguarding arrangements. And they will be making changes to the legislation about regulation and inspecting independent schools, and bringing multi-academy trusts into the inspection system. Perhaps one of the things will be around the status of teachers, working towards having all teachers to have the qualified teacher statement. I think that again, where CPOMs can help you, one of the changes will be to enable serious teacher misconduct to be investigated, regardless of whether the misconduct in the setting where the teacher was employed. For instance, if you had a teacher involved in an unrest, this could be covered through the school. That's quite important that CPOMs, in terms of staff safe, would be able to do that. So, to summarize on how CPOM's Student Safe can help you, first of all, you can change the names of the categories. You can add new categories. So if you want to add a category around domestic abuse and the effects on the child, such as the emotional abuse, you can add those. You can also change the categories. For instance, things like peer-on-peer abuse can be changed to child-on-child abuse, so that we can use language that be more effective. And we can also update names as appropriate. And we can also add subsections. So, for instance, you could have a domestic violence category and include in that subsections: emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse. So you can add subsections to that. So we can drill down more effectively. We can also add fields to prompt for the rationale when decisions are making, why we decided to make a referral, why we decided not to make a referral. We can add fields to prompt us to make decisions or to record what decisions were made, and also to record referrals made to specific organisations, which is really great when it comes to reporting to your Board of Governors. One of the great things about the integration that CPOMS has with schools MIS, and that can help identify what those unexplained and persistent absences are, what the links are to the safeguarding or welfare concerns. Are the absences, were they following a bullying incident? Were they following a neglect incident? Were they following a disclosure of abuse? What is going on? And this is really important, because one of the things that COVID has learned to all of us is that one of the reasons why many children are safe, are not being further abused, is because they are in schools, because teachers and school staff are keeping them safe. And so that's school absences, I think, are really key to that process. And it enables us to link those absences with well-being and safeguarding concerns on the macro and the micro level. So thank you very much for listening in today. If you want to know anything more about CPOMS, please do call us, or you can email us, or you can look us up on the internet. From Sam, thanks everybody for listening in, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.